Hey there, Star Riders. Welcome back to Diary of the Cosmos, where I spill my tea in the corner of the galaxy, share my stories, and sometimes we learn something new along the way. But before we get into today's video, I generally just want to say thank you, because somehow in this little corner of the galaxy, we have grown to 229 Star Riders. And I know to some people that number might seem small, but to me, that means a lot because that means 229 people decided to spend time with me, listen to my thoughts, my rambles, my deep dives, my chaos. And honestly, that means a lot to me. So, whether you've been here since the beginning or you randomly found one of my videos at 2 a.m. while avoiding sleep, thank you for being here. Thank you so much for supporting the channel. Thank you for growing with me. And thank you for allowing Sincerely Yours to become a space where we can talk about media, storytelling, emotions, honestly, life. Because videos like this, these are the conversations I really love having with y'all. And today's conversation started because I had a realization while rewatching Victorious. Like, you know what's crazy? Like, growing up, I thought Beck was the perfect boyfriend. But now that I'm older, Andre was clearly the better option. And once I realized that, I started noticing a pattern in a lot of shows I grew up watching. The emotionally intelligent black characters, the loyal ones, the emotional supportive ones, they really got treated like the romantic fantasy. And honestly, I think we need to talk about why. And I think part of the reason so many of us like characters like Beth growing up is because teen media romanticized emotional unavailability. Because Beck was known as the quiet guy, the mysterious guy, and the emotionally distant guy with the pretty hair and a good jawline. And media framed that as depth. But looking back now, a lot of it was just emotional unavailability with good lighting. And teen shows constantly push this idea that if a guy was emotionally confusing enough, that somehow made him romantic. The whole I could fix him fantasy, where the girl has to break through his walls, understand him differently, be patient with his distance. And if he finally opens up emotionally, that means she won. And I think media also confuse emotional instability with chemistry because Jade and Beck had chemistry, but they also had trust issues, jealousy, constant arguments. Like they had issues upon issues upon issues. But because the relationship had intensity, it got framed as passionate. And psychologically, that actually makes a whole lot of sense because research on relationship psychology has found that inconsistent affection can make emotional attachment feel stronger because the brain starts chasing emotional rewards unpredictably. So when somebody gives affection inconsistently, your brain start chasing the possibility of closeness. And honestly, that explains so many childhood fictional crushes. And this is where adulthood completely changed my perspective because Andre was emotionally available in ways teen male characters usually weren't. He listened, communicated, checked on people emotionally, comfort his friends openly, and honestly, that becomes way more attractive when you grow up. And Andre had this grounding energy too. He was kind, he was patient, he was supportive, and calm. And let's be honest, the people around him were chaotic. And Andre rarely escalated situations emotionally. He knew how to emotionally show up for people. And then there's the fact that Andre was generally talented. He created music, produced, wrote songs, understood the artistry of music. But what I love most is that his talent never made him arrogant. He respected people emotionally. And honestly, that level of emotional immaturity gets overlooked so much in teen media. And one thing that really stood out to me rewatching Victorious was how much chemistry Andre and Tori actually had. They sang together constantly, created music, and supported each other emotionally. And music mattered in Victorious because music was how characters emotionally connected. And Andre generally showed up for Tori emotionally. He encouraged her, helped her when she struggled, supported her creatively, and sometimes helping Tori genuinely inconvenienced him, but he still showed up. And what made their relationship interesting is that it wasn't built on chaos. It was built on friendship, communication, creativity, and emotional trust. Honestly, that sounds healthier than half the relationships teen shows try to convince us were soulmates. The more I rewatch Victorious, the more I realize Andre was basically everybody's emotional support system. When somebody had a problem, Andre listened. When emotions got too high, Andre grounded people. But the show rarely stopped and asked who emotionally supports Andre. Honestly, that happens to a lot of black characters in media. They become emotionally dependable but not romantically prioritized. Tucker Foley might be one of the clearest examples of this trope from childhood cartoons, because when you actually sit down and think about Tucker as a person, he had a lot of qualities that people claim they want in a partner. Tucker was loyal, and not just a normal friend level loyal. This guy found out his best friend was half ghost and immediately said, "Okay, cool. Like, what are we going to do next?" Like, he stood beside Danny through ghost attacks, villains, secret identities, and world ending disasters and somehow never clocked out. Like if loyalty was a person, it would probably be Tucker. But he wasn't just loyal, he was supportive too. And I don't think we talk enough about how often Tucker encouraged Danny. When Danny doubted himself, Tucker believed in him. When Danny struggled with his powers, Tucker helped him. When Danny felt overwhelmed, Tucker was usually right there. And honestly, that's emotional support. And what I find really interesting is that Tucker wasn't written as some perfect character either. He could be immature sometimes, he could be goofy and obsessed with technology, but that's what made him feel human. He felt like a real kid. And honestly, Tucker was smart too. Not in the flashy genius way like Danny's parents, not in the super scientist type of way, but Tucker was resourceful. He adapted to situations quickly, helped solve problems, and used technology creatively, and let's be real, a lot of Danny's problems or plans would have completely fallen apart without Tucker. But despite all of that, the show rarely framed Tucker as desirable. And that's the part that fascinates me now as an adult. Because when Danny walked into the room, the audience was told this the guy you were supposed to pay attention to. Danny got the love triangles, the romantic tensions, the emotional buildup, and the girls fictional and in real life fighting for him because I ain't gonna lie, I was fighting for Danny. But Tucker, Tucker was actually standing right beside him. And what's interesting is that as a kid, I never questioned that because the show taught me not to. And now that I'm older, I look at Tucker completely differently. Because loyalty is attractive, consistency is attractive, showing up for people is attractive, and being emotionally supportive is attractive. And I think that's part of the larger conversation this video is really about. Sometimes media teaches us to chase the exciting characters while overlooking the dependable ones. And honestly, Tucker might have been one of the best relationship options in that entire show. The older I get, the more I think Cyborg was one of the most underrated characters on Teen Titans. Because when I was younger, I thought Cyborg was cool. But now that I'm older, I'm sitting here realizing this guy had an insane amount of boyfriend material. Like, let's start with the obvious. Cyborg was funny, but what made his humor work is that it never came at the expense of his emotional depth. A lot of cartoon characters get reduced to being the comic relief. Their entire job is to make the audience laugh, but Cyborg never felt one dimensional. He could be funny one minute and deeply emotional the next. Honestly, that's one of the reasons he still feels so relatable today because he felt like a real person. And one thing I've always appreciated about Cyborg was how emotionally open he was. He wasn't trying to act mysterious, pretending not to care, or hiding behind emotional distance. When he loved his friends, you knew. When he was excited, you knew. When he was hurt, you knew. Honestly, I think that's one of the healthiest qualities a person can have because emotional openness requires vulnerability, and vulnerability requires courage. But what really stands out to me now is how loyal he was. Cyborg loved the Titans like family. He protected them, supported them, and showed up for them. and it never felt transactional. He wasn't helping people because he wanted something in return. He helped people because he genuinely cared. Honestly, that kind of loyalty is hard to find. And then we have to talk about his intelligence, because I genuinely think people underestimate how smart Cyborg was. This guy wasn't just using technology, he was creating it. He built things, modified things, and engineered things he understood. He also understood things most people couldn't even begin to understand. And my favorite example is the T car. This man literally built a car, not bought one, not customized one, built one. He designed it, created the blueprints, found the parts, put everything together, and honestly, that takes an incredible amount of intelligence. And low key, Batman was probably looking at the Teen Titans budget, wondering why money for car parts were disappearing out of his account every month. Because ain't no way Cyborg was building all this advanced technology without Bruce Wayne accidentally funding part of it. But here's what really gets me. Despite all these incredible qualities, being funny, being loyal, emotionally open, protective, intelligent, confident, the show really frayed him romantically. And when you compare Cyborg to some of the other Titans, it becomes very noticeable because Robin and Starfire were given years of romantic buildup. The awkward moments, the emotional vulnerability, the romantic tension. The show constantly reminded us, like, hey, this relationship matters. And honestly, it worked. People still talk about Robin and Starfire today. People still remember their moments. People still root for them. And then there's Beast Boy and Raven. Now, technically, that relationship became much bigger in later adaptations in fandom spaces, but let's be honest, the fandom ran with that ship. People love the opposites attract dynamic, the cheerful guy and the emotionally guarded girl, the sunshine and the storm cloud pairing. Then we get to Cyborg, and that's where things start feeling different. Because Cyborg actually had potential romantic storylines. He wasn't lacking chemistry, lacking personality, or lacking emotional depth. For example, there was definitely some potential between Cyborg and Jinx. They had playful interactions, they bounced off each other well, they had chemistry. The chemistry was there. But honestly, even I ended up seeing more chemistry between Jinx and Kid Flash than Jinx and Cyborg. And I think a lot of the fandom felt the same way. That one episode left such a strong impression on people to the point that Jinx choosing to move away from villainy because Kid Flash believed in her, it created one of those relationships that fans immediately attached themselves to. And because of that, the possibility of Cyborg and Jinx kind of faded into the background. But honestly, the relationship that always stood out to me more was Cyborg and Bumblebee, because unlike Jinx, Bumblebee felt like somebody who naturally fit into Cyborg's world. Bumblebee was smart, capable, and confident. But let's not forget, she was literally leading Teen Titans East. And honestly, I think that's part of why I like them together. Neither of them needed saving, neither of them felt emotionally dependent on the other, and they felt like equals. Imagine that dynamic for a second. Two intelligent black superheroes, two leaders, two people passionate about helping others. That relationship has so much potential, and yet the show never really explored it. We got moments, chemistry, and hints, but we never got the emotional investment, the slow burn, the romantic focus, or the relationship development. And that's really the point I'm making. Cyborg wasn't lacking romantic possibilities, lacking chemistry, nor lacking qualities. He had everything people claimed they wanted in a romantic lead: humor, confidence, intelligence, loyalty, emotional openness. But unlike some of the other Titans, the narrative never fully treated him like a romantic destination. And honestly, the older I get, the more I notice that pattern with a lot of black characters in media. They're allowed to be loved, to be important, to be dependable, but they're not always given the same level of romantic investment. And that's why Cyborg stands out to me so much now, because when I look back at Teen Titans, I don't just see the funny guy anymore. I see one of the best catches on the entire team. Virgil Hawkins might be one of the most important examples in this entire conversation for me. Because unlike Tucker and unlike Cyborg, Virgil wasn't the sidekick, he wasn't the best friend, and he wasn't supporting somebody else's story. He was the story. And I think that's part of why Static Shock felt so special growing up, because for a lot of us, Virgil was one of the first teenage superheroes we got to spend real time with. He wasn't some background character, he wasn't comic relief, and he wasn't the wise friend giving advice from the sidelines. He was the hero, and that mattered. But what made Virgil stand out wasn't just his powers, it was how human he felt. Because Virgil wasn't written like some kind of perfect hero. He made mistakes, he got embarrassed, and got nervous around girls, and he had awkward moments. He said the wrong thing at the wrong time sometimes. But the awkward charm made him feel real. Because growing up, Virgil felt like somebody you could actually know. He felt like somebody who could be in your classroom or somebody who could sit next to you at lunch. And I think that's why so many people connected with him. He was smart too, but not in a way that felt disconnected from everybody else. He learned how to use his powers creatively. He adapted quickly, figured things out, but he still felt like a teenager trying to navigate life. And honestly, that's a difficult balance for a show to pull off because Virgil wasn't just fighting villains, he was dealing with homework, with friendships, and with family expectation while also growing up. And the show never let you forget that. One of my favorite things about Static Shock is how much emphasis is placed on family. Virgil loved his family, he respected his father, and he cared deeply for his sister. And even when they disagreed, you could still feel the love underneath everything. And honestly, I think those family values help make Virgil feel emotionally grounded because being a hero wasn't the only thing that mattered to him. Being a son mattered, being a brother, and being a friend mattered to him. And that's part of what gave him emotional depth. Static Shock wasn't afraid to let Virgil struggle emotionally. The show talked about responsibility, fear, pressure, loss, identity. And because of that, Virgil never felt one dimensional. He wasn't just a superhero, he was a kid trying to figure out how to carry responsibilities that most adults would struggle with. And honestly, that emotional vulnerability is one of the reasons people still love Static Shock to this day, because vulnerability makes characters memorable. And here's where I think the conversation gets interesting. Virgil had crushes, he had relationships, and he had romantic moments. But when people talk about Static Shock, those relationships usually aren't the first thing people remember. They remember Virgil as a hero, a role model, and a good person. And honestly, there's nothing wrong with that. But I do think it speaks to something bigger because even when black male characters are allowed to be heroes, they're not always framed as romantic fantasies. They're respected, admired, and loved, but sometimes they get loved differently. And honestly, that's why Virgil is such an important example in this conversation because he proves black characters can be intelligent, funny, vulnerable, heroic, family oriented, and emotionally mature and still deserve the same level of romantic attention that other heroes receive. And honestly, if we're talking about boyfriend materials and cartoons, Virgil deserves to be way higher on that list than people give him credit for. I think this conversation would feel incomplete if I only talked about black boys, because black girls experience this too. And the older I get, the more I realize this conversation isn't just about who gets relationships, it's about how those relationships are written. Because growing up, I noticed something that I couldn't quite put into words at the time. A lot of black girls were allowed to be funny. We were allowed to be loud, confident, and entertaining. But we weren't always allowed to be cherished, and there is a difference. Because when I think about a lot of the stories, love stories I grew up watching, the girls who got the soft music, the emotional confessions, the grand romantic gestures, and the unconditional devotion, they usually weren't black girls. And that doesn't mean black girls weren't present because we were there and we were present. But sometimes it felt like we were present without being emotionally prioritized. And honestly, that's something I didn't fully understand until I got older. Because as a kid, you don't necessarily notice representation in an academic way. You notice it emotionally. You notice who gets chosen, who gets pursued, who gets adored, and who gets the fairy tale ending. And after a while, those patterns start settling into your subconsciousness to the point you start quietly asking questions without even realizing it. Like, what does the dream girl look like? Who gets loved the loudest? who gets the grand gestures, and who gets picked. And honestly, I think that's part of why representation in romance matters so much. Because romance stories aren't just entertainment, they teach people what love looks like. They teach people what desirability looks like, who the people who is worthy of being pursued. And sometimes black girls got pushed into very specific boxes. Instead of being allowed to be emotionally layered, we become stereotypes. We become the loud friend, the sassy friend, the aggressive friend, and the overly confident girl. Don't get me wrong, there is absolutely nothing wrong with being loud. There's nothing wrong with being confident, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with being outspoken. Problem happens when that's the only version of black femininity that gets shown, because then audiences stop seeing those characters as emotionally complex people. They start seeing them as archetypes, and archetypes rarely get the fairy tale ending. They rarely get the slow burn, and they rarely get the emotional center of the story. And honestly, that's why I think some of Andre's relationships on Victorious always felt off to me. Because I don't think the issue was the girls, I think the issue was the writing. A lot of the girls weren't written as fully emotional counterparts for Andre. They were often exaggerated, more possessive, more dramatic, and more focused on physical affection. And because of that, the relationships often felt like punchlines instead of emotional journeys. And honestly, black girls deserve more than being the joke. We deserve to be the love story too. We deserve to be written with softness, with vulnerability, with emotional complexity. And that's why characters like Valerie stood out so much to me. Because Valerie felt like a person. She wasn't perfect, she wasn't a stereotype, and she wasn't there just to support somebody else's story. She had goals, struggles, flaws, and dreams. And because she felt like a complete person, the romance felt more believable. And honestly, that's all I ever wanted from representation. Not perfection, just humility. Because black girls deserve to be loved in stories the same way we deserve to be loved in real life. Not as lessons, not as side characters, not as stereotypes, but as people who are worthy of being chosen, openly, softly, and completely. One character that keeps coming back to my mind while writing this video is Libby from Jimmy Neutron. Because looking back now, Libby was actually a cool character. She was confident, talented, creative, she loved music, and wasn't afraid to express herself. And honestly, as a kid, I thought Libby was cool. As an adult, I find myself wondering if the show really knew what to do with her. Because whenever people talk about Libby, a lot of the conversation usually goes back to the same things: her loud moments, her reactions, her catchphrases, her comedic scenes. And while those moments were funny, they were often became the main thing people remembered about her. And I think that's where the problem starts, because Libby had a lot more depth than that. She was actually one of the more emotionally intelligent characters on the show. She cared deeply about her friends. She was supportive, she was loyal, and she knew who she was. And honestly, that kind of confidence is something I appreciate way more as an adult. But instead of emphasizing those qualities, the show often leaned into exaggerations. The jokes got bigger, the reactions got louder, and the comedy got emphasized. And after a while, the audience starts seeing the jokes before they see the person. And that's something I think happened to a lot of black girl characters growing up. They become memorable for their energy instead of their emotional depth. And that's what's interesting. And what's interesting is that Libby actually had a romantic storyline. She and Sheen eventually became a couple, and even then, the relationship was usually played for laughs. And don't get me wrong, I thought some of their moments were cute, but compare that relationship to how other romances are often framed in media. Where's the emotional buildup? Where's the vulnerability? Where's the slow burn? And where's the sense that we're supposed to emotionally invest in them? And honestly, that's what I think was missing. Not because Libby wasn't worthy of it, but because the show didn't always frame her as somebody the audience should emotionally romanticize. And that's the distinction I keep coming back to throughout this video. There's a difference between a character being liked and a character being desired. A difference between a character being funny and a character being emotionally prioritized. And I think Libby deserved more opportunities to be both, because underneath all the jokes, all the exaggerated reactions, and all the comedy, there was a smart, talented, kind, and emotionally grounded young woman. And honestly, I think she deserved a love story that treated her like one. Valerie is one of the reasons I started questioning how Black girls were written in romance stories growing up. Because if I'm being completely honest with y'all, I had actually forgotten about Valerie for years. And then one day I came across a video on TikTok of Danny and Valerie scenes together. And I was sitting here thinking, like,
Wait a minute! Who are you?
because why do these two have so much chemistry? Like, seriously. And I know this might be controversial. I think Danny and Valerie sometimes had stronger chemistry than Danny and Sam. And before the Danny and Sam fans start throwing tomatoes, like, hear me out. Danny and Sam actually had history together. They had years of friendship, shared experiences, and eventually became canon. But chemistry and scene and screen presence aren't always the same thing. When Danny and Valerie were on the screen together, there was this constant emotional tension. Danny cared about her and Valerie cared about him, but neither one of them had the full picture. She was hunting ghosts, and Danny was a ghost. And that created this really interesting dynamic. Every interaction felt layered, every conversation felt like it had something beneath it. There was attraction, there was conflict, there was misunderstanding, but there was also respect. And honestly, those ingredients created some really compelling scenes because Valerie wasn't written to simply admire Danny. Valerie challenged him, she questioned him, and she had her own goals, her own struggles, and her own perspective. And I think that's part of why their chemistry worked so well. It felt like two fully developed people trying to navigate complex feelings. And honestly, that's what I wish more Black female love interests were allowed to do, allowed to be. Not just somebody's girlfriend, not just somebody's crush, and not even just a supporting character in somebody else's love story, but a fully realized person whose presence changes the emotional energy of the story. And Valerie did exactly that. One of the most fascinating examples in modern animation has to be Amber and Mark from Invincible. Because before we even talk about the relationship itself, I want to give out a disclaimer. I never watched Invincible on Amazon Prime. Never had, and I ain't gonna say I never will, but I'm gearing up to watch it. But how I know about Amber is because I'm in the Invincible um area around TikTok. So I liked Invincible um analysis video on TikTok. And so now from time to time I get Invincible content. But either way it goes, um I going back to Amber, I think we need to talk about Amber as a character. Amber wasn't written as a stereotype. She wasn't written as a joke. She wasn't written as a one dimensional girlfriend whose entire personality revolved around her boyfriend, Mark. Amber was emotionally intelligent. She was socially aware. She cared about her community and she had goals outside of Mark. And honestly, I respect that because Amber felt like a real person. She had standards, boundaries, and expected communication. And I think that's where the controversy starts because Mark wasn't just a normal boyfriend, he was secretly invincible. He was disappearing constantly, missing dates, making excuses, and he was keeping a huge part of his life hidden. And from the audience perspective, we knew why. We knew he was saving the world, he was fighting villains, and we knew he was carrying this enormous responsibility. But Amber didn't know all of that. She was experiencing the relationship from the perspective of a teenage girl whose boyfriend kept disappearing on her. And honestly, a lot of her frustrations make complete sense when you think about it from her perspective. Now that it, now that doesn't mean everybody has to agree with every decision she made, but I do think some of the hate Amber received became way bigger than the actual situation. Because if you spent any amount of time online, people were mad, like really mad at this situation. And meanwhile, another character was quietly gaining more and more support, Eve. And honestly, I completely understand why people love Eve. Eve and Mark naturally understand each other. They share the superhero experience. They understand the sacrifices that come with the job and understand the pressure that ties with it. It feels smoother. And because of that, their relationship feels easier. It feels smoother. It feels less complicated. And and that's exactly why so many viewers rooted for them. But here's the interesting part. Some fans are now saying Mark and Eve's relationship is becoming a little boring. And honestly, that fascinates me because when Amber and Mark were together, people complained about the conflict. But now that Mark and Eve are together, things are healthier. Some viewers miss the tension. They miss the drama, they miss the complications, and miss the emotional friction. And honestly, I think that's really revealing because it goes back to something I've talked about throughout this entire video. Media has trained us to associate conflict with chemistry, to associate emotional difficulty with passion, and struggle with romance. And sometimes when a relationship becomes healthier, people mistake stability for boredom. And I think that's a conversation worth having because Mark and Amber's relationship wasn't perfect, but it was emotionally messy in a way that felt believable. They misunderstood each other, they hurt each other, and struggled to communicate. And honestly, that sounds like a lot of teenage relationships. But what stands out to me most isn't even the relationship itself, it's how differently Amber and Eve were received by audience. Because Eve often gets framed as the ideal partner, while Amber often gets framed as the obstacle. And I think that's what makes this example so interesting for this discussion because Amber wasn't just a girlfriend, she was a fully realized person. She had opinions, standards, and emotional expectations. And honestly, I think black female love interests deserve more room to be complex people without automatically becoming the villain of somebody else's love story. After writing this entire video, I realized this conversation wasn't really about Andre. It wasn't about Tucker, Cyborg, or Virgil. It was about me. Because somewhere along the way, my idea of love changed. And that's a weird thing to realize because when I was younger, I generally thought characters like Beck were romantic. The mysterious guy, the emotionally distant guy, the guy who barely communicated his feelings, and I wasn't the only one. Media spent years telling us those boys were desirable. They got the music, they got the dramatic scenes, and the emotional buildup. They got framed like the prize, and honestly, I bought into it. I thought mystery was romantic. I thought emotional distance was depth. I thought confusion was chemistry. And now that I'm older, I don't want that anymore. I don't want confusion. I don't want mixed signals. And I don't want to sit there wondering if somebody likes me. Especially, I don't want to be in a relationship where everybody around me is asking, are y'all even together? I want certainty. I want somebody who loves me publicly. I want somebody who is proud to be with me. And I want somebody who makes it obvious, not because I need constant validation, but because I don't think love should feel like a guessing game. And honestly, that realization hit me harder than I expected because growing up, I watched so many love stories. I watched girls get chosen, get pursued, girls that get the big romantic speeches and the girls that get the fairy tale ending. And sometimes I would quietly wonder where the girls who look like me fit into those stories. Because black girls were there, we were always there, but sometimes it felt like we weren't the ones getting the grand romance. We were the best friend, the funny friend, or the strong friend, but we weren't always the girl getting the cinematic love story. And honestly, I think that's part of the reason this topic stayed with me, because every girl deserved to see herself loved, not tolerated, not settled for, and not chosen after everybody else. Loved fully. And I think that's what I've been searching for in media all along. Not perfection, just proof. Proof that girls who look like me are worthy of the same kind of love stories everyone else is getting. The soft love stories, the healthy love stories, the unconditional love stories. And honestly, that's probably why Andre hits differently now because when I was younger, I was chasing excitement. But now I appreciate peace, communication, emotional availability, consistency in somebody who shows up. And maybe that's what growing up really is realizing that the things media taught you to want aren't always the things that are actually good for you. And if I ever have children one day, especially sons, I want them to grow up understanding that healthy love is not boring, that communication is attractive, emotional vulnerability is strength, that being emotionally present for your partner matters. Because I don't want my future children learning love from toxic television the way a lot of us accidentally did. I want them to know that the healthiest relationship in the room isn't the boring one. It's the goals. And honest, maybe that's the biggest reason my taste changed. Because eventually you have to stop confusing emotional chaos with love and start realizing that peace is beautiful too. That's what I think this whole conversation comes down to. Not just who got the love story, but what those stories taught us about love in the first place. Maybe you agree with everything I said. Maybe you disagree with half of it. Either way, I hope this video gave you something to think about the next time you revisit one of your favorite childhood shows. Because sometimes when we rewatch old stories, we aren't just learning about the characters, sometimes we're learning about ourselves too. Drop your thoughts in the comments below because I would love to hear them. And I want to ask you guys, was there a character you thought was the perfect boyfriend or girlfriend when you were younger, but completely changed your mind about as an adult? Trust me, I know I can't be the only one who owes Andre Harris and the other black male characters an apology. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that bell to join the journey through the stars for more out of this world ideas. Until next time, keep your pen to the stars and your heart in the pages. Sincerely yours.